turns out you have to hit unmute. But what's interesting about it is, right, so scientists are appointed by governments to the IPCC, and you're not a permanent member, you're appointed for doing a report. And so as a result, you kind of serve both as like the scientific expert, but you are a government representative. So if you travel to one of these meetings, like the federal government pays for it of the country or whatever. And so it's an interesting thing because it's kind of partly a scientific organization, but really it's an intergovernmental organization. And what this means when it comes down to it is the reports of the consensus reached by the scientists and approved by the governments. And so when it comes to the final summary for policymakers, which is the thing most people will end up reading, that's been approved by governments. And so when you have someone like President Trump saying, well, I don't think climate change is real, his government okayed reports saying climate change is real, right? So interesting thing about the existence of the IPCC. And I'll just get a little bit into how it kind of works. And I like this. This is like from the original charter, basically, this long quote, and it really tells you so much about what the work is. To assess in a comprehensive, objective, open, and transparent basis. So key word, assess, right? And then it says, what are we assessing? The scientific basis of human-induced climate change and its potential impacts on options for adaptation and mitigation, which that last bit basically sums up what the 3 working groups do. In effect, there's some words probably that are left out, I think we could say. And then the next piece of this paragraph is the most important one. IPCC reports should be neutral with respect to policy, although they may need to deal objectively with scientific, technical, socioeconomic factors relevant to the application of particular policies. Which, in other words, the way it's usually said, they're policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So anything that's being assessed in the reports is being assessed because it's important useful for governments to make decisions, but the report is not going to tell people what to do, which is the reason when it's covered in the media, people are often disappointed by the reports not telling people what to do. They're not supposed to, right? So the structure then comes down, this is the sort of the standard structure how the IPCC works. So you have a bureau of people that sort of sit above co-chairs of the different working groups, chair of the overall IPCC, there's an executive committee and everything. There's also like a technical support unit of people that help out a little bit with the reports, but it's not a lot of people. So it's not like a big operation. It's not a huge staffed office or anything. And then you have the working groups, the 3 working groups, which are established. The members of that are going to be established before each report, each assessment report. This one coming out now is the 6th one. And then there's also some other special reports and things that happen. There's a separate whole task force on how to do greenhouse gas accounting. That's work's been underway. And beneath all of that, which you can't quite see at the bottom, are all the authors, contributors, reviewers, et cetera, and the roles they play. I'm actually going to skip over that. And so how does this happen? Like, how does somebody get involved? The steps it's incredibly complicated. So it starts with, before the reports, there's going to be an initial scoping meeting between governments and representatives, meaning scientists that were nominated, so you can apply to do it, to go to the scoping meeting to say, well, how should the report be structured? We know what working group 1, 2, and 3 are, but you still have to choose the chapters. And so those are established at this initial scoping meeting. And then there's nominations for authors to represent the different countries. And so in Canada, an email will go around and you can send your name in if you want to be nominated. And then the Canadian government's going to choose to nominate people to the IPCC based on their background, their experience, and they do now really try to do a good job to reflect diversity. And I wouldn't say working group 1 is as good at this, but working group 2 was completely 50. In fact, I think it was a 55% women this time, which is very new compared to how the reports used to be. So they choose the chapter plus teams. And then just to give you a sense of it, this was our schedule I was originally given for working group 1. So this started back in 2019. We had our first lead author meeting in January, and it was supposed to be completely out and done by 2021. COVID delayed this. And so we just, for working group 1, just submitted our final draft of the report. They call it the final government draft because it's not what you're going to read. It's the draft that now goes to the governments for them to approve. Mostly, they're only going to look at the summary for policymakers. They're not going to look at each of the detailed chapters, but they could. And as we'll talk about, even if you only look at the summary for policymakers, what might happen is someone might say, why are you making this statement? And then you have to go back to the chapters and trace back, where is your evidence, right? So just a little bit about the process. I don't need to go over to that. The key thing that you see in IPCC reports, and Rachel's probably going to show you some of this. I just give you an example of a sentence at the top, right? It's not fun reading, right? There's a lot of language in italics, and there's a lot of things in brackets at the end, right? So the brackets is the traceability. Where did we get this statement from? So this is from the Summary for Policymakers for the report that just came out. So there's all the places that these sentences are based on. And then the italics is a likelihood assessment and confidence assessments. And so the IPCC, it was settled a few assessment reports ago, settled on uncertainty language to use, which is very strictly defined. And there's a process you're supposed to go through to decide what is the confidence in the scientific community on this subject, or the research community, I should say, based on how much the research that's out there agrees in the total amount of it. So how much evidence is there and how much agreement is there, you can come to confidence. And then if there's actual numbers involved, if there's statistics involved, or you could do an expert elicitation involved, you could then state the likelihood. So a sort of statistical likelihood that the assessment is correct. And so virtually certain means greater than 99%. High confidence usually means there's high agreement and robust evidence, but there's some give exactly in how you get to those confidence levels. This is what makes writing the report so hard, is this part of it. It's one thing to make a statement in a research paper. It's another thing to assess confidence of the entire community. And the work that goes into this is incredibly exhausting. This is just to give you an example. I clipped this out of an Excel document of traceability for one section of one part of chapter 3, which I'm an author on. And it's from a draft. So this is not the published thing, so I can show it to you. This is just for one part of a sentence is this table. And we have one of these for every time there is a likelihood or confidence assessment. So you really, it is in that way, not a review. It is an assessment. And that's a really important distinction. It means that all sorts of research won't get mentioned in the IPCC reports, because if it's not really policy relevant, there's not a need to assess it. You know, we're not just writing, it's not writing a review paper, you're writing an overall thing. And so with this, a few take-home messages. I hope that hopefully this gives you a bit of a sense of how the reports come together. The first is policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. The IPCC is not supposed to and not going to tell anyone what to do. The goal here is to assess, not to review, which has been, I have to say, a very interesting challenge to keep coming around to. There's a whole area of, you know, some of the areas I was working on. I was working on an oceans and coastal ecosystems chapter. I'd have whole areas of literature that we'd come to conclude, you know what, it's actually really not that policy relevant, even though we've learned a lot in the past few years. And so we just don't need to assess it. And which can be depressing sometimes. You realize your work is not actually that policy relevant. But the big thing you hear a lot, and you'll see a lot in the report, is they'll say multiple lines of evidence. Because when you're trying to do an assessment, it's easy if you can just say, well, there's 4 models or 20 models and they're similar, and we can just look at their results. But usually it's a mix of paleoclimate data, modeling data, experiments, et cetera. And that's what makes the assessment challenging. And you'll see a lot of language in the report where they said we used multiple lines of evidence to come to this conclusion. And usually it's where those lines of evidence don't totally agree that the outcome of the report has a lower level of confidence into it, or that the outcome of the report ends up upsetting a lot of people in the research community, where we think the IPCC should have been more stronger on this issue. And they're like, well, the evidence was different from different sources. The traceability, as I mentioned, is incredibly important and is probably the most exhaustive part of this. And the last thing just to mention is, yes, people fly around the world for these meetings, not during COVID. And by not being able to do this in person during COVID, it did make it harder to work on the report. But the big thing was that it was unfair to all the author teams that are authors that are from the developing world and are not as connected to the research world. And I don't even just mean an ability to use Zoom, but just ability, this is an opportunity to connect in part of the world. And so that is part of the IPCC's role, is this kind of science diplomacy. And I didn't really get this until I was involved in this round. And now I see not having the meetings in person was actually really destructive. because it really, people lost an opportunity. And so that's really interesting. I can talk about the implications of this a little bit, and I'll just leave as, I'll mention this later, actually. I'll let Rachel join in, but just I'll provide a quote later in case anyone's curious, from a colleague of mine in the Pacific Islands. When people were arguing, we don't need to hold meetings in person, she sent this incredible message saying, you don't understand how important these in-person meetings are for people in my part of the world. Yeah, so anyways, so that's an introduction to the IPCC. And I'm going to pass it off to Rachel.
Great, thanks, Simon. And I think I learned a lot about this whole process from that as well. Oh, maybe not. Great. Cool, thank you. So, right, that's about the process. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time telling you about some of the updates and some of what's in this Working Group 1 physical science basis report. And so, there we go. I thought I'd actually take you through a little bit of a story of what the different reports have said. And so it's sort of interesting in the scientific community. You know, this report made a lot of news in the media, but in the scientific community, it was more of a case of, well, we know what it's going to say. It's just sort of saying the same thing every time. And there's not that much new in it. And so I'm really focusing on, well, what is actually new in this particular report? And so here's the first assessment report, AR1 in 1990. And so their judgment was that global mean surface air temperature has increased. It's broadly consistent with predictions of climate models, but noticing that it's the same magnitude as natural climate variability. So they can't actually attribute it to human causes at that point. By 1995, they got as far as the observed warming trend is unlikely to be entirely natural in origin. So really being cautious about what they're saying here. By AR3 in 2001, they actually say most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. And this is where Simon brought this up as well, that they have these words now start to mean something quantitative. So it sounds descriptive, but this likely means that it's greater than 66% chance of being true. And they've really sort of stuck with that language since. And so AR4, most of the observed increase is very likely due to anthropogenic human-caused greenhouse gas concentrations. By AR5 in 2013, we got as far as it's extremely likely. And so it's like, well, where are we going from this point? Well, what can AR6 say? And so AR6 actually said it is unequivocal. There's no sort of probability here. That's one of the first statements in this report, is that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And as Simon said, this is in the summary for policymakers. So every government in the world that's part of this, which I think is every government?
I don't know.
Okay, right, has agreed to this statement that it's now unequivocal that humans are warming the climate. And I just pulled out a couple of other statements sort of from this first part, that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented. So not only is it unequivocal that we're warming the climate, but the speed at which we are doing that is out of the range of anything that's been seen for the climate in the last at least 2,000 years. And it's already having an impact on these climate and weather extremes in every region across the globe. And so there was also a lot of focus in this report about the impacts on extremes. And so focusing sort of on some of the science, one of the sort of key actual things that was interesting to scientists from this was the narrowing of climate sensitivity. And so the definition of climate sensitivity, which unfortunately you can't see because there's a zoom bar in the way, is that it is the warming that you get, so the global mean temperature change for a doubling of atmospheric CO2. And so sort of taking out the, oh, well, how much CO2 are we going to put into the atmosphere? Thanks, Simon. We have this climate sensitivity of, if we doubled it, how much would the Earth warm? And so this is a nice graph that actually takes us through. So in 1979, there was a Charney report that first sort of estimated what this climate sensitivity should be. And then as we go from left to right, we have these consecutive reports of the first, second, third, fourth. And so you can see, you know, from 1979 to 2013, essentially the range didn't change. And then the sort of key interesting bit with this report is actually the range has narrowed, and we are sort of, scientists are sort of narrowing it down on a slightly narrower range of climate sensitivity. And so they've in particular sort of discounted some of the lower values of climate sensitivity. And so we're not going to be lucky about this. It's not going to turn out that it's actually only 1.5 degrees Celsius. They're like, that's not really a plausible outcome at this point. And what's also interesting is adding in sort of going back in the past, like to the history of this. Ooh. So Arrhenius was a scientist that first sort of wrote about these experiments of what would happen if we, as humans, put more greenhouse gases, more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And he had some estimates in 1896, it was about 5 to 6 degrees of warming. And actually his estimate in 1906 was sort of about in the range of where we are now. So in terms of sort of progress made on climate sensitivity, we do know roughly what will happen if we keep adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the thing I have now added to this slide, because I've been made aware of this, was actually the first person to note that carbon dioxide was going to have an impact on the temperature of the Earth was Eunice Foote, a woman who presented this at a conference in 1856. And when I say presented it, I mean a man presented it for her. And decided to preface this with, I had it in the notes, so I'm going to try and get the quote right. But he was essentially explaining to everybody at this conference that it turns out that the sphere of woman embodies not just the beautiful and the useful, but also the true, which was clearly a surprise to some of them. Anyway. I just wanted to add this slide, and this speaks a little bit to what Simon was saying about these multiple bodies of evidence. And so there was quite a, and I don't know how much it made it out of the atmospheric sciences world, and so whether any of you were aware of this, but for each of these assessment reports recently, we've been running climate models and a new set of climate model simulations, and then those go into the report to understand these projections. And so CMIP6 is the latest one of them. And so there was a lot of sort of information as model results were coming out, a lot of talk in the scientific community about how these models were warmer and they were projecting higher climate sensitivity, they were projecting higher temperature projections into the future. And so there's a lot of talk about what that meant for our projections, what that meant for climate sensitivity. And so it's quite interesting to compare these graphs. So on the left, we have these different climate model projections and the estimate of climate sensitivity from these. And you can see that in CMIP6 on the right, actually there's a much broader range of possible climate sensitivity and going up quite high. And how do we get from that to this smaller range of climate sensitivity that the report actually says? And this comes from this multiple bodies of evidence. And so really including a lot of paleo evidence and looking into, well, the models that have higher climate sensitivity, do they accurately reproduce what we know about paleo temperatures? And if they don't, perhaps we can exclude that value of climate sensitivity from what's likely. And so really they've used all of these bodies of evidence from paleoclimates and long records back into the past to assess these models, to assess and come up with this final value of climate sensitivity. And I just thought I'd show a few slides of some of the key figures that they've got on extremes. And so sort of really focusing on the impact of climate change on extremes around the world. And so this is a figure that's showing what's already been observed. And so this is where they're sort of really highlighting that climate change has already increased the number of hot extremes in pretty much every region of the planet. And so this is a map of the world in weird hexagons. And then we can focus more on sort of individual events. And so this is looking at hot temperatures over land, a 50-year event. And so on the left, they've got this happened once in every 50 years. So if you think about the hottest event that happens once in 50 years back in the pre-industrial times, and going forward into the future into sort of 2 or 4 degrees, if we have 4 degrees of global warming, that event will happen about 40 times every 50 years. And so that's a huge increase in the number of these hot extremes. And you can also see that the intensity of that 1 in a 50-year event, it's not just that that same event will happen more times, but those events will also get hotter. And they've got new things for the heavy precipitation. And so there's a lot of sort of pretty secure science that as you increase temperatures, heavy precipitation and the intensity of those really extreme precipitation events will also increase. projections for sea level rise, what's kind of interesting is that they've included this low likelihood but high impact storyline. And so we've got these different sort of scenarios here of sort of different futures that we might go in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but they've included this, well, we don't know enough about Antarctic ice sheets and the Greenland ice sheet to know for certain that they are stable under these levels of warming. And so they've included under sort of the highest projection of greenhouse gas emissions, this low likelihood, but it hasn't been ruled out by the science impact that these ice sheets would become catastrophically unstable and we'd see a much higher range of sea level rise. We've also in this report sort of gone into a sort of more broad direction for these new scenarios. So we used to have representative concentration pathways or RCPs, and we now have these SSPs, which are more social. Oh, I don't actually know what that stands for. But essentially to do with how the social structure of the globe is going to go, whether we're going to go in a sustainability direction, whether we're going to go in a direction of inequality where some countries are very rich and some countries remain very poor. But the key difference is that they've sort of said within each of these, actually there are mitigation pathways we can do. We can still mitigate climate change in each one of these different scenarios. And so for each scenario, we've got this range of different sort of RCP scenarios that sort of match up with the RCPs in terms of the end radiative forcing by the end of the 21st century. But they're sort of saying that whichever way we go, we can still mitigate climate change. It isn't the case that if we go in a direction of rapid growth, that's it, climate change is going to be a catastrophic problem. There are mitigation scenarios here that would help keep those warming temperatures lower. And so I just wanted to add, I think this is one of the last slides, how are we doing on our Paris Agreement? And so in 2015, the Paris Agreement was that we're going to keep the average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And so this is just a table suggesting, well, what do we need to do that if we want to keep it to 1.5 Celsius? So we can look at this table and say, okay, this is the amount of carbon budget we have left to us if we want a 67% chance of keeping the temperature increase to 1.5. We've got 400 gigatons of carbon. And given currently we're releasing 40 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere each year, that does not give us very long. And so that's why in some of these high mitigation scenarios, it actually goes below zero. And so that says to actually reach that lower temperature, we have to start taking net carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't just have to get to zero emissions. We have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And I'm going to stop talking, but I am just going to leave up a short video that you can watch. And so there's an interactive atlas that has also come with this IPCC report. And so you can actually really go into it. There's just, I did a short screenshot of me exploring it. But the link is there if you just Google for the interactive atlas, and you can really explore a lot of the different information that they have. This did work when I tested it. Cool. And so this is just going to show there's paleo data, there's global climate model data, there's regional climate model data, there's all sorts of different scenarios and warming scenarios, different variables. And so super interesting for both research and for teaching. So thank you. And yeah.
This?
I don't know. I need it for the Zoom people, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Rachel and Simon. So we'll start with questions now, and in keeping with our tradition, we'll start with questions from students first. So I guess it's students in the room who've taken the risk, if you will, of physically coming here, get first dibs at questions, then students who are virtual, and then on to the others. And you should repeat the question, Simon, so the folks.
Sure. We both will, yeah.
A lot of these reports, I find that they're very hopeful. And there's a lot of, if we do this now, you know, we'll get this result. And I feel like we've been saying that for the past 10 years, and we never do the if we do this now. And I wonder if, like, how much when we're writing these reports, do you ever get told we have to keep this as hopeful as possible to kind of make people not as scared and kind of, but then I feel like that kind of goes into the, oh, this is an issue for later on. So I wonder, like, is the writing of this, do you ever get told as writers we have to keep it and do it like the, I know we should like the least, I think we did stuff now, this would be the result, versus more reality, what actually the reality is.
So the question was, to what extent the person, what's your name, by the way? So Tessa was asking the question, was saying the report seemed to be very hopeful sometimes, and is this a narrative that is developed in advance and people are told to do it? I'd say no. It's not really the way the assessment works, with the exception that the reports are so complicated. I mean, there's like thousands of pages, and this is only one part of it, right? That the team that drafts the summary for policymakers is sort of put in the place to figure out how to distill it all together. And so there is, I think, I mean, from the bit I've seen, I think, you know, I wouldn't say that there's a narrative pre-chosen, but there is kind of like trying to figure out what's the storyline going to be. I don't think anything would get omitted necessarily because of that in the main message, but but there is sort of a storyline. The one exception I might give a little bit was that, you know, we're talking about the normal IPCC assessment cycle. In the Paris Climate Agreement, the IPCC was requested by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, separate body. Could you do a report on what's the impacts of 1.5 degrees of warming? And also they asked for a report on the oceans and on the land. And so these 3 special reports happened in between the last 2 assessments. And the special report on 1.5 degrees, I think put the writers, and because of the structure of it, the writers of it, the authors of it, but also the scientific community at large, sort of in this position, well, now we have to compare 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. And I wouldn't say that that necessarily forced a certain narrative, but it meant that, listen, the carbon budget left to avoid 1.5 degrees is very small, but it meant that the research community was going to figure out, well, come up with pathways to get there that's going to have a lot of negative emissions later in the future, et cetera. And so I do feel like some of that was inadvertently forced, you know, as a narrative onto the report, but it was what was requested under the Paris Agreement. So I don't really know what else could have been done. I'll just say that, like, you know, the SR 1.5 report was criticized for that, but it is also what was requested of it. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I'll just say that within the guts of some of the reports, it's possible maybe that, like, the coordinating lead author of an individual of an individual chapter really wants to push a certain thing and it gets through, but there's so many rounds of review that it's pretty hard. Like, I've watched it, it's pretty hard to do. It's just too complicated a process. So
Yeah, and I'll just add from sort of reading it, I don't necessarily get a hopeful feel from it. There's just there is a possibility that there is something we could do. And so I think sort of without that, if they didn't do these lower scenarios where we're taking greenhouse gases out, and they were just like, that's it, like, it's 3 degrees of warming and it's over. I think it's more useful to have this goal of there is a pathway. We just have to make the effort technologically and social structures to follow that pathway. And you're right, we're not. But it's nice to know that there is an option, I think, that otherwise what would we do if there wasn't? Yeah.
So I haven't been a part of, I'm only part of as a lead author. Oh, I should repeat the question. So the question was, given that this is that the reports are both the consensus of science and governments, is there ever time the government has sort of blocked a report or blocked something? So a report hasn't actually been stopped, but the negotiations of the summary for policymakers are incredibly complicated and go on, and language does get watered down. I'm trying off the top of my head to think of a strong example. Hadi's going to know some. The probability. Yeah. So then and then if I'm right, was it the word discernible? There was like 3 days of debating about one word.
1995,
Yeah, it was 95. But I'll give you an example, a detailed example of what happened. So in the negotiations, it's going to be a country, Saudi Arabia doesn't like how strong a statement is. And they're going to say, we don't think this should be very likely. Show us the evidence. And that's why we go through all this work on these traceability tables. So you can go back and everything. And I'll give an example. I was not involved in the process, but I was a reviewer that was consulted for the fourth report. And they wanted me to read everything about coral reefs in every different chapter. And just to say, do you think they agree with each other? Because it is complicated. These are big reports and everything. So as a result, I had read every single thing about corals that was in the report that went into the final government draft. And then when it came out and Summary for Policymakers came out, the temperature range that was given as a threat to corals, the low end was not anything I had seen before. So it does happen. Yeah.
I can add
You might,
to that. So in 1995, when that discernible influence of human activity on climate change, that line was in the report, it led to a massive outcry, both from the right wing in the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, you name it. And that's when the late great Stephen Schneider actually came up with this schema to assign probabilities to these linguistic, extremely likely and so on, and then also set up these traceable accounts. So all of this is in fact a reaction to what happened when something relatively anodyne, like discernible, was included in the report. So, there's always all these histories to all of these things kind of deeply embedded inside the IPCC.
No, thanks for the context. That was great.
I'll just add, and this to me, all of that and hearing and knowing about all of that background is why it's so interesting. It is such a big deal that this report says it is unequivocal. Every government has agreed to that exact wording. Every government has agreed that it is unequivocal we are warming the climate.
I believe it also says established fact at one point.
Yeah, I think so.
Hi, thanks so much for this overview of how the IPCC works. I'm actually interested in what you were saying about the science diplomacy part. Who gets, like, in terms maybe of equity and institutional, like who gets who, like which researchers are part of the report, like in terms of having leading outwards from the global south, like what are the dynamics there, like who gets included, who gets the lead author, and like that's one question. But also I had a question about and I've noticed that you've been making a differentiation between saying the scientific community and the research community. I'm just curious to know like what.
Yeah. So so the questions were about so the balance of knowledge and expertise coming from different parts of the world, from the global south, and the science diplomacy. And the second part was about research versus scientific community. On the second part, that was just me. My instinct as a scientist is to say scientific community, but I want to remind everybody this isn't just about science. Working group 1 is almost entirely, but working group 2, which I'm a part of, our author team is not all scientists, and it's all sorts of different social sciences research playing a huge role in working group 2 for sure, and then obviously in working group 3 as well. As for the diplomacy part, so it's a good question, and I summarized the IPCC too quickly to get into that part. So the author teams are chosen for balance. Each chapter is going to have 2 coordinating lead authors and then a bunch of lead authors. And it always makes me laugh that they call you a lead author, because to the outside, it sounds like you're in charge and you're not. The coordinating lead authors is going to be one from the developed world and one from the developing world. And I think just using the UN definitions of developed and developing, it's a really good system. Those are pretty binary definitions. And so you do tend to end up with a lead author from the US and a lead author from South Africa, right? And so not to say that South Africa isn't technically a developing country, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's somebody from a small island developing state on every chapter. So you have that, and then they've really, I can't say as well for working group 1, but I can say for working group 2, they've tried really hard to increase the diversity of representation. And so our author team had, I think, 5 continents represented. Yeah. And so there is a real effort to do that. And, you know, what happens is there's going to be all sorts of people that are top experts on a subject that don't get to be on the report because the US can only put so many people in, or Canada can only put so many people in, where there's going to be people from other countries that know the subject, but they're not one of the top experts, but they're on the report. But there's a reason for it, right? That's the science diplomacy. And that's also trying to, there's a little bit of trying to build science capacity in other parts of the world. In terms of even just travel to the meetings, the IPCC, I can't remember exactly how it works, but like the Canadian government paid for my travel to the meetings, but the Canadian government and the other developed countries' governments also pay for the travel for the other people, for everyone else to the meetings as well. So I don't think it's a perfect system by any means. And I know that it's a real struggle for Working Group 1, where so much is physical modeling based and the capacity doesn't exist. But I just put up this quote from my colleague I won't say what country she's from, but just to sort of drive home how valuable other people see the IPCC is, and so people in other parts of the world. So,
Sorry to butt in.
yeah.
But I actually have a paper on this topic. I forgot about that. In 2011, so it's dated now, but a paper analyzing over time the distribution of authors from different parts of the world and so on. And a couple of patterns, it's been a while, so I don't remember the details, but a couple of patterns. First is that there's something called a collaborating author, or
I should talk about that.
So there's a third category, which is we need someone to write something on this. We'll call them contributing author, it's called.
Yeah.
And so you look at the list of contributing authors and it's huge. And it's largely dominated by people in, industrialized countries. So that's one way in which you sort of bring the expertise in. And the second pattern, these are the two patterns that stick in my mind, is English. If you come from an English speaking country, even if you're poor, there's a much greater chance of you being involved in the IPCC. But I think, they've been trying hard to solve the problem through the mechanisms that Simon cited. And I think, it's in a far better place than it was, say, in the mid-90s.
I'll just add to the contributing author thing. It's interesting. I forgot about the paper Malin put together. This has really evolved because there's now, I don't think there used to be any guidance, but there's really strict guidance on how to do everything now that I'm imagining wasn't there before. So contributing authors, I've been a contributing author before. You've done it, Hadi, I'm sure you've done it at some point. Okay, there we go. So contributing author means, like Hadi was saying, so like there's a section of the report that it turns out like the 12 of us, none of us are really experts on it. So you bring in people that all they can do is contribute, write that one section. They're not allowed to see anything else. It's a bit of a crazy system. We were told to make sure not to fall into this trap. It's part of the guidance. And as a result, we really worked hard to make sure the contributing authors, you can't just invite all your colleagues, which is what always used to happen. So it really has changed. And I think you'll see, if you look at the author list now, on the front of the chapter, you'll see the CLAs, the coordinating lead authors, the lead authors, and then the big list of contributing authors. And you'll see it's much more diverse internationally than they used to be. Yeah, I hope so. At least it is in Working Group 2. So,
anyone else from the live audience? Okay, so last one here, and then we'll move to the Zoom panel.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to go a little bit on a tangent, but given the COVID context and this goes around, you've heard the analogies to emissions as well, and how that market has changed over the past year and a half. I was wondering if you had any comments on what to expect next month of the climate summit. Do you think the timing of the report with COVID and the narrative change will produce some change? Can you think about that?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So the question was, particularly with the analogy with COVID and sort of flattening the curve and things we've learned about, what we can do with the economy to mitigate an upcoming disaster. With the upcoming conference of the parties next month, are we expecting something different? So from my perspective, I think yes. I think as the reports are getting stronger, and so we had the Paris Agreement. I think all of these countries are now on board that it's unequivocal. And so with the Paris Agreement, we had these, you know, voluntary, each country voluntarily said, these are the emission reductions that we will commit to. And I think that's a very complex issue, because as soon as you get into demanding that, demanding that each country follows that thing, you probably never get agreement on what that looks like, because you've got differences between developing countries, and should developing countries who haven't yet benefited from burning fossil fuels have to do the same reductions as other countries? And then other countries saying, well, if those developing countries don't, and we're still emitting all of their greenhouse gases, why should we? So personally, I don't expect to see any sort of firm, yes, this is what everybody has to commit to. I do expect to see countries committing stronger pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, and whether the plans are there to meet those pledges is another question. So, yeah.
So we'll move to the Zoom crowd there. And Bulgan is going to read out some questions, and you can do the same protocol.
In the areas of IPCC report you are focused on, what are some aspects that are understudied and need more research to be done on? And are there any sections in the report where such areas have been clearly identified?
I'm trying to think.
Yeah, great question. So the question is, sort of, are there any areas of the report that sort of have been identified as needing more study? And so definitely for the physical science basis aspect, cloud feedbacks has been a key thing that's been identified over the past sort of, probably sort of 20 years or so, 40 years, thanks, as being a key uncertainty in narrowing down this climate sensitivity. And so there's been a lot of work on that in recent years, and potentially some of this decrease in the climate sensitivity in this current report is actually from better understanding some of these cloud feedbacks. In terms of the impacts, again, I think this sea level rise and how stable the Greenland ice sheet is, how stable the Antarctic ice sheet is, there's a lot of sort of, we don't know, we have some best estimates, but actually there's so much uncertainty in understanding this, and the possible impacts are so large that is really a key area of research. I'd say, I mean, generally the thing is, the science is pretty settled in terms of this is going to be bad and we should do something about it. And yes, there are still some uncertainties about exactly how bad this is going to be. But in terms of sort of thinking about these reports as telling us if we should do something, they've been saying that for a very long time. But there are still these interesting research areas of that, still need work. Any others?
The only thing I'd add, which is not going to be in this working group, but certainly in this report, but working group 2, I think what's being identified is so it's the working group 2 talks about the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And so how do we consider like adaptation into our forecasts, and so into our projections, and meaning from ecological adaptation to human adaptation. And there's a lot more effort to include that, but they're just, all these reports can do is assess what's been done, right? There's not original research. So
How is one done? And it says that Simon could elaborate more on how the IPCC report is circulated to. And assuming there are some formal meetings between the authors of the report and government representatives, this conversation took them. And Kai offered to chime in this conversation.
Why don't we answer that question first?
yeah, so the question was about how do the reports actually get to governments? Are there meetings between the authors and government and everything? Boy, I would love to do, Melinda and I have talked about this, to do a piece of research about who actually reads the IPCC reports in governments. I really don't feel like I have a good knowledge of that. There's an IPCC secretariat in most of the countries. There's like a office, it's a Canadian office that is in charge of the liaison. And so and then there's a board of people in Canada that are in there doing the negotiating of the report on behalf of Canada. So they all know it, and it's sent around. Whether people read it, anything, even, I'm not even clear how many, I mean, certainly not the chapters, but the SPM, I'm not even clear how many people for sure read it. And so this is a really good question. But it's not something that people at I'm a low in the rung, like it's not something that people at my level would necessarily be doing. Yeah. And I'm going to guess Kai could comment on it. Yeah.
Do I get a chance to speak now? Sorry, Simon, were you asking for me to chime in?
Go for it.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't know that much about who reads the IPBES reports, but I wanted to, I was wondering the same. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I stationed myself in Ottawa for my sabbatical when the summary for policymakers for the global assessment was coming out, so that I could do a little tour of my own and talk to Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Environment Canada, or Environment and Climate Change Canada. But what I wanted to comment on was just how different my experience was with IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in terms of the role that the nations took with in terms of the negotiations of some parts of the summary for policymakers, where I think, Simon, you talked about how governments don't really seem to be, trying to hold back some of the findings. And in the global assessment, there was definitely a strong effort by a few nations to hold back some of the findings. Now, these were future-oriented findings that actually came from a chapter that was a backcasting analysis. Can you hear me, Simon? Okay.
Yeah, we're just getting an echo. I'm just trying to fix it.
Okay. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Not your doing.
So it came from a backcasting analysis, right? Which is like evaluating scenarios for the future. And basically nations wanted to take out all kinds of findings about different kinds of policy solutions that they didn't like, that they didn't want to be featured in there as being an important part of solutions, right? And it was fascinating to see that, but we could, because it was actually part of the analysis rather than just being part of the speculative discussion about policy options, we could actually push back. And so we ended up keeping every single piece basically that they wanted to remove, but it was a fight every time.
I'll thank Kai for the perspective and just add that wait until the negotiations for working group 2, the same thing will happen. And that's why the traceability is so important. They can't pull something out if you have really good evidence for it, or not as easily pull something out, I should say.
Comments and questions for Simon and Rachel. Their audiences are curiously bad at interpreting scientific uncertainty that from the very light trees, etc. Does it matter that we've attached specific probabilities to these certainty categories if the public perceives them all as less than completely certain and therefore uncertain? How much is the risk communication and perception literature considered in the communication of IPCC findings?
Susan. Happy to. Sure. I think, could everyone hear that in this room? Okay. So how is the risk perception literature? So I think one of the challenges is that this system was that was developed a number of years ago, and they're sticking with the same system, the confidence and likelihood assessments. Yeah, that's true. There's more categories, right? There's a number, I mean, I can't think of too many off the top of my head. I use some of them in class. There's a number of good papers showing that people's perception of what very likely means is not what the IPCC thinks it means, and that's a problem. I don't know that it's being dealt with very well, but it's complicated because it would require like redoing how the confidence assessments are done, and it's such a central part to the work. So I think that's hard. This, I think, speaks to the other question, though, of who actually reads the reports, right? And these are intended for governments and to some degree other experts. And in fact, in the guidance authors now get, it says SPM, here's who it's meant to be read for, summary for policymakers, chapters, who we expect to read it, et cetera. And to be frank, lay people are not expected to read it. And so one way around that is that they've created these frequently asked questions. And I think starting in AR4, they had a science writer work with the author team to write them. So the writer didn't do them on their own, but worked with the author teams. And I can tell you that now the IPCC has a couple of science communication specialists that work with you on them. I think they've gotten a lot better. I still don't think I think they're really just make it more understandable for the policymakers. I still think it's not really aimed for the public. And I think that's really true when it comes to interpreting the IPCC figures, which usually have like 15 different dimensions in them and are pretty hard to follow. So would you agree?
Yes, very much agree on that. And the other thing I sort of want to add that I think partly another reason why it's useful to have these very quantitative descriptions is the language issue that was brought up, that, all right, we're in an English-speaking country or an English-speaking part of a country. And so what does someone whose English isn't their first language see as very likely and likely? And so by having those numerical connections to those, that makes it more equitable across, across different languages. But yes, what that is interpreted by readers and who those readers are is a really great question. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone reads, how many people read the report in other languages too?
Yeah, they're published in the 6 official UN languages, basically.
I think that US criminal dramas have a role in this, because US criminal court requires absence of uncertainty. If they have dramas about civil cases where you look at preponderance of evidence, the public would be educated about relative uncertainty. So, just think about how many hours of criminal drama, drama you watch, and how it's being drummed into your head. Is there any uncertainty in the guilt of this person? Well, then as long as you're assumed to be innocent until that is resolved. So I think actually that's a cultural issue related to US drama.
So we need like a CSI IPCC.
We got, I guess, time for 1 or 2 more questions. Go ahead.
There's one question. Among scientists involved in writing IPCC report, are any of them representing fossil fuel companies?
Well, the question was, are there any of the scientists representing fossil fuel companies? Yeah, in the past, right now, it's hard to say. I'd have to look at the author list, but it happened in the past. The thing to keep in mind is that, of course, everybody's appointed by the government. And if that's what the government wanted to do, and that's what the experts were, it's not happening in Canada, but other countries for sure. I'd have to look at the author list. They're not all university scientists. It's like university, government, and like one of our CLAs is from an NGO, but like perfectly qualified expert, just not working at a university.
There was an excellent scientist, Harun Keshki.
Yeah, there you go.
Who worked for Exxon. But we've met him, Hadi and I, at several meetings, and he was a thoughtful, interesting researcher. So take it for what it is.
But I think it's worth saying that I'm not sure how the question was intended, but it would be hard for a government to like plant scientists to water down the report. It wouldn't work. It's just too much. There's too many checks and balances involved. There's too many other people involved. It just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a contributing author about 4 or 5 times, and I get to write 2 paragraphs. But in any report, I haven't been able to look and find my own words at all. Right? Every word has been changed. So that tells you something at least about the sort of checks and balances of the process. I think we are out of time. Can we squeeze one last question in there? Oh, it's a question from the room.
Sorry, thank you. I'm not a student, so just waiting.
No, sure, absolutely.
Thank you for your presentation. What would be the role of an academic research institute to either and start to affect?
I can answer. But
Yeah, great question. So the question is, what is the role of academic institutes such as UBC in using the results, using these reports. And so I think there is a large role for these academic institutions to emphasize the importance of these, to be doing some of the science that would help us take us down some of these mitigating pathways where we are learning how to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, and educating the public with outreach, educating schools, and getting our expertise and actually interacting with the public. And so everybody sort of understands how important this is. And we're not expecting lay people to go around and read the IPCC report, but we can have scientists who are good science communicators communicating this to the public, and also interacting with governments as advisors. That's, yeah.
Yeah, and for lay people, but that doesn't mean that what the reports have in them doesn't make it out. So first of all, the media does that, but the other thing is who reads the report is people like me, right? So I was a reviewer for Working Group 1. I wasn't an author on it, but I have now incorporated tons of stuff from Working Group 1 in everything I'm teaching this semester, right? And so then that, gets out to a bunch of 18 to 21-year-olds. So I do think that they trickle out. It's just indirect. And we could probably do better to make it more direct. And I just wanted to say, I saw a question pop up about authors and are they paid? And no, this is a volunteer position. I should have mentioned at the beginning. Southern authors are paid, yeah.
I want to ask David if the PCO reads, if it's actually in the PCO reads the policy.
Yeah.
David, can you hear us?
David, if you happen to be there, we're trying to embarrass you. They to Hadi, to your point, I've heard that they do. I've heard that they do. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Oh, can we hear him?
Simon, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
I can try. David, you're welcome to speak.
Yeah, could you repeat the question?
Hadi's wondering. Hadi's wondering if you think the Privy Council office reads the SPM of the IPCC reports.
Yeah, I would say there are probably a couple people in there who would do that.
Thank you very much. That was a great session. And thank you all for being patient with our